Hey everyone, I have Troy Higgins here. He is a senior campaign manager here at Kitcaster. Thanks, Troy, for meeting with me and chatting with me today.
Thanks for having me on, Brandy. I am excited to be here.
Awesome. Well, one of the things that we struggle with most, especially here at Kitcaster, is metrics. Metrics around podcasting. Really challenging.
Yeah, definitely. It's an ongoing discussion, debate, um, and even controversy at times in the podcasting world, as metrics can be very tricky to track down, and it's kind of like seeping through all of the data or sifting through all of the data to find what matters most and how we can get the most out of podcasting.
Yeah, why do you think it's so hard? I mean, it just like in every other digital medium, it seems like it's easy to obtain these data metrics. Why do you think podcasting is so challenging?
It's just such a lucrative and dynamic space and industry, and the data is just so spread out and all over the place. It feels like the big conglomerates that hold all the podcasting data are either A, hard to get in touch with, hard to communicate with, or B, it's just small individual hosts and people that are responsible for this data for their own shows. So finding the best ways that we can track this data, identify what data is most important, and how we can make that data quantifiable and determining what makes a great podcast placement. Um, like one of the questions we always get is, how many listeners does this podcast have? Can you get me on bigger podcasts with a bigger audience? And the truth is, while audience size is important, focusing solely on it overlooks crucial factors. There's so many other things that can play into whatever your strategy or goals are that you want to get out of podcasting.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think that a lot of people turn to the listenership because they don't really know what other metrics are important. What else should they be looking at? And there's so many other factors involved in determining whether a podcast is valuable to you as a guest coming onto the show. And I get it. Like you're spending your time with a podcast host with the intention of getting your message out to a broader audience, a wider audience. So I mean, I understand the desire, but I think, what we can do here is kind of educate folks on the different types of metrics that are even out there, things that they should be looking at outside of pure listenership, which is often really hard to get. And even sometimes when we get listenership data, it's not necessarily accurate.
That's the thing. Yeah. Is it accurate is always the question.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So what, kind of looking at some of the other things that people should be paying attention to and really determining based on somebody's goals, what are the right metrics to be looking at?
Yeah. So what we found is there's a whole bunch of categories that we look at as far as metrics that can be used to determine whether a podcast is a good fit for our specific campaign goals or strategies. Some of the things we look at, just to name a few, is who's the host, what's their influence, how many interviews has the host conducted, categorical relevance, is this podcast relevant for the discussion we want to be having, audio quality, like production quality. A show's production quality can go a long way. And if a show has bad production quality, that can go a long way as well
Yeah.
in the wrong direction. Guest history, what type of guests have they had on? Distribution channels, where's the podcast available? Episode frequency and consistency. Is this podcast being published, weekly, monthly? All of that kind of determines how engaged their listeners are. We look at podcast growth rate, so we can see a podcast growth rate, so we can see how much the podcast has grown from the time of its inception until now. So that kind of helps us estimate the reach that we will see over time. Because as you know, as these episodes are published, they exist on the internet forever. And that's one of the beautiful parts about podcasting, is just because this, episode might not have its peak listenership when it's first published. It can gain traction much later on. That's just the nature of podcasting. And also, do podcasts repurpose content? Repurposing content is huge in the podcasting space today, as we both know, across social media platforms like Instagram, TikTok, YouTube Shorts. It's just the emphasis on the short form content repurposing. I cannot emphasize enough. And also, we can use these different metrics to specifically target goals that we have as guests on podcasts, whether it's brand awareness, thought leadership, lead generation, network expansion. We can kind of categorize these different metrics and leverage them in a way to make sure that we're reaching these goals to the best of our ability. Like, for instance, let's just use brand awareness as an example. Some of the main metrics we would look at if our main goal to get out of podcasting is brand awareness is host influence, opportunities for promotion, and distribution channels, because this is going to be, those are all three things that we can target to get the most out of our repurposed content and kind of build our brand and marketing strategy around our company or business or personal brand that we're trying to promote.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even just kind of going back to the very first thing that you mentioned, and that's who is the host? And people get into podcasting for various reasons. You have celebrity podcasts who are coming to the podcast world as a way to kind of expand beyond whether they've been in film traditionally, music, whatever their vein of entertainment is, they're broadening to podcasting. So you have that audience, right? Which is obviously going to have kind of a built-in fan followership.
Absolutely.
And then you have hosts who are experts in their field. These are people who have just a desire to dive into the thing that they love to talk about most.
Right.
And then I think you have these hosts that are just genuinely curious. They want to have good conversations. They're doing it to meet new people, to perhaps just expand their network. So I would say, and in our world, Troy, I think a lot of what we're dealing with is the middle category, right? Which is hosts who have an expertise in a particular field.
I would agree. I would absolutely agree. And it's all about finding the right host, with the right interview format, the right show format, and that can make a huge difference in the message or story you're trying to tell on the podcast.
Yeah. And I think especially for more B2B brands, especially in the innovation space, when whatever it is that they're bringing to the world might be a little bit more complicated to describe, or maybe their sales cycle is a little bit longer, being able to connect to a host who has expertise in that world to really break down what they're doing in a way that is intriguing and makes sense to the listeners seems really valuable.
Yeah, the value in having a host who truly understands what you're doing and is an expert on the subject matter is, you can't put a value on that. Come on. That's a metric that matters right there.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think it's interesting because, like, it still happens that companies put out white papers that are more technical and really dive into their technology, their business model. But this is, I think, a form of a white paper, but it's adding extra validation to what you're doing. So I think that is by far the most important aspect to all of this is who is the host? How are they showing up? What is their influence? Something that I think we've talked about before too, Troy, is like, who are the guests that they're bringing on to the show?
Yeah. I mean, the guests that hosts are bringing onto the show are, it's as Ryan, our co-founder, always speaks to, he alludes to the law of symmetry, right? So it's guests that are going to evenly meet them in a balanced way to discuss whatever this subject matter is that they're experts on. And it's going to be, if the show, let's say, if the guest has 1 million followers across social media, then they may be appropriate for a Joe Rogan podcast where Joe Rogan is reaching millions of listeners across, each episode. Whereas, let's say, a more middle range podcast with several thousand listeners or whatever it is may attract a guest that might not have the biggest following, but they're going to be able to really dial in on that subject matter as an expert being the guest and the host. So there's kind of, as I always like to refer to Ryan's law of symmetry, there's always a balance between the guest and the host that just tends to work out so organically if you can really find the right fit and the right match.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think if you're looking at different types of shows and hosts and taking a look at the library of content that they've put out and who they have interviewed in the past and what topics they have touched on, to really get a good understanding of kind of where you are going to play in this world, in their world and in their podcast. So I think it's just a really important aspect. It's just kind of taking a look at the guests that a particular show has had previously.
Yeah, absolutely. An example I can think of is the Dad Edge podcast, which the show is about being a parent and fatherhood. But if you look back at some of the guests they've had, I mean, they've had like Tom Brady on the show. They've had these huge figures who you wouldn't really think of as, being on a parenting podcast, but they're relevant and they have a connection to, whatever the new guest may be in a certain way. So I do agree, looking back at the history of guests on these shows can make a huge impact and just overall support the brand that you're trying to portray.
So one of the huge benefits, I think, to podcasting is SEO.
Right.
And the different ways that it can work for you in SEO, using it as a leverage. I mean, I think there's the obvious one where you are getting those backlinks. If a podcast host is publishing on various platforms, perhaps they're putting out a newsletter, they have their own website where they're hosting all of their episodes, they're possibly posting on YouTube, all these places that you could potentially get some backlinks to your website. Now, not all platforms allow for this, but there's quite a few that do. So I feel like that is a super rich SEO activity. And I would say that also repurposing the content would be another one. Do you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Repurposing the content is arguably the best version of SEO. With the algorithms these days across all social media platforms, whether it's Instagram, TikTok, YouTube Shorts, whatever
LinkedIn.
It is. Yeah, LinkedIn. The algorithms are so sophisticated and advanced with funneling content that is relevant to certain audiences. It's amazing. And if you're repurposing this content and even using something as simple as hashtags is just going to drive the SEO optimization through the roof.
Yeah. I mean, I know I've done this personally, and I'm sure you have too, but I have gone into Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and I've searched something that I'm interested in learning more about.
Mm-hmm.
And it pulls up a bunch of different episodes from a lot of different experts that touch on this particular subject. And I'll tune in, and if I find somebody that I align with, then I go and search their name
mm-hmm.
and try to hear everything that they have ever said in podcast interviews. Have you done the same?
I have done the same. Yeah, definitely. For specific subjects. Absolutely. And one amazing part about that is let's say you stumble across a show that really stood out to you, you're going to go back and listen from episode 1, not just that most recent episode, and listen to the whole show. So whatever guest was on that show at any point in the lifespan of the show has potential to be heard.
Yeah, and I think that that's one of the more complex aspects to podcasting, because we're a culture that wants instant gratification. So when a podcast episode goes live and we're not immediately getting a flood of interest, we're like, what did we do? Did we not reach the right people? Did we not say the right thing? But knowing that that content is always there and the way that people listen, it's not, there's very few podcasts that I'm like, oh, they dropped a new episode. I can't wait to dig in.
Right.
But it is there for me to listen to when I have time.
Mm-hmm.
Or when I'm commuting and doing some sort of activity that I always tune into podcasts. And then also when I do find you're exactly right. When I do find a podcast that I love, I go all in. I'm listening to like the last 2 years of the episodes that they have done.
Oh yeah, couldn't agree more. And oftentimes I find the best episodes just hidden within the lifespan of the show. And that's where you're going to discover the content and the really cool guests that, are going to be experts on the subject matter that you're interested in.
Yeah. And there's something too that plays into the human psyche when you are looking up someone and you've never really heard about them before, but you're like, okay, I listened to a podcast with this AI expert.
Mm-hmm.
And what they said was really interesting. And the way they explained it, I completely understood. I want to hear more. Mm-hmm. And when I'm doing even just a simple Google search for this person, and there's like pages of podcast episodes that populate, there's like that validation for me. Like this person knows what they're doing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's just whether it's true or not, there's something that happens when you see through a Google search this person being a guest on a long list of podcasts. You're not even clicking on the podcast to see how many views they have, how many followers they have. Just that image of seeing all those podcasts mentally plants something in your brain that this person's an expert. They know what they're talking about. It happens.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you're looking to build a name for yourself in a particular industry, what better way to do that?
Couldn't agree more.
So as we kind of wrap up this conversation, Troy, what would you say are maybe some of I feel like we've covered a lot of the not so obvious metrics, but are there any others that we need to discuss that maybe might not be top of mind for most people?
I think we went over a lot of them. Some of the more, I guess, some of the ones that would be less obvious that we need to look at, but are very important. There's just, again, some of the things I went over, which can be content relevance. As obvious as that may seem, you want to make sure you're on a podcast where the content and the subject matter is relevant to your expertise, and it's a conversation that you're going to be able to cover topics that you're passionate about. We want to make sure you're not going on a podcast that's irrelevant to you. And as I said before, the interview style, which kind of also just plays into the host. What kind of interview are you looking for? Are you looking for a conversational format or more of a formal format? Both of these metrics are just different ways and different things that are really important that we can use to make sure that we're aligning with the strategy of your podcasting campaign and getting the most out of whatever goals that you might have, whether that's, like we said, brand awareness, thought leadership, lead generation. We're going to take a really close look at all these different metrics, obvious or not, and make sure that they're aligning as closely with the guest goals as possible.
Yeah, fully agree. I mean, I think, again, because listenership just seems like such an obvious metric to measure, and one that most people are like, well, the listeners would equal brand awareness, lead gen, whatever those things might be.
Right.
But it really, what I've heard time and time again from a lot of our clients is, I went on a show that had like the highest listenership out of all the shows in the whole campaign, but it had the least amount of impact for their business. And that is because the audience was different. It was just a different makeup, and maybe not the audience that wants to be hearing the exact topic that they want to be discussing and isn't ready to make a move, or not even in the mindset of whatever it is that this person is bringing to the conversation. It's not something that they're actively searching for. So I think
Totally.
these are really important metrics to consider when you are starting a campaign, starting to look at podcasting as a way of getting more brand awareness, more thought leadership, more lead gen, and really determining what are those factors that are important to you.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And like you said, with the bigger podcast, bigger audience by nature means there's going to be more general listenership.
Yeah.
Whereas, back to the conversation of categorical relevance, interview style, the audience might be smaller, but you're going to be hitting that niche audience that's specifically interested in the subject matter you're talking about. And we just weigh these metrics to determine, what is the best way we can reach our goal.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Troy, for chatting with me today. It was super fun to go over these metrics that matter. And hopefully, this helps a lot of folks kind of determine what matters to them.
Yeah, absolutely, Brandy. Thank you for having me on. And I hope the listeners were able to learn something today.
All right. Thanks so much.